I told her my roommate won't be home tonight. She didn't even pause. She just looked at me across that crowded conference table, her pen still moving across the notepad in front of her, and said, "Then I'll be here," low, certain. Like she'd already decided before I'd finished the sentence. That was how it started, that was how everything unraveled. Her name was Simone Adler, and she was the kind of woman who walked into a room and quietly rearranged everyone's attention without appearing to try. She was 31, 7 years into her career as a corporate strategist, and she had been hired 6 months ago to consult on the Halden account at our firm. I was the account director. Her boss, technically, which was exactly the problem, except it had never quite felt like a problem until tonight. I'd been carrying the tension of her for months the way you carry a stone in your shoe, constant, specific, impossible to ignore. Every Monday morning briefing where she sat directly across from me and dismantled my proposals with this calm, devastating precision that made me want to argue back just to keep her talking. Every elevator ride where we stood 3 feet apart in silence, and the air between us seemed to thicken into something you could press your hand against. Every Friday afternoon when she'd gather her folders and leave without looking back, and I'd find myself watching the door for a beat too long. I had told myself it was professional respect. That I admired her mind. That what I felt in my chest when she walked into the room was simply the anxiety of someone who didn't like being challenged. I had been lying to myself for exactly 6 months. Tonight, the office had cleared out early for a team dinner I'd skipped because I had reports to finish. Simone had skipped it too, though she hadn't offered a reason. She'd been at her desk across the open-plan floor, and I'd been at mine, and there had been nothing between us except 60 feet of empty office and the low hum of the ventilation system. Around 7:30, I'd looked up and found her already watching me, not quickly, not shyly, just watching the way you look at something you've been thinking about for a long time. I don't know what made me say it. I'd been planning to go home alone. I'd been planning a lot of things. "My roommate's away for the weekend," I said, and I heard how it sounded as soon as it left my mouth, not like a professional statement, not like small talk, like an invitation. She looked at me for 3 full seconds, then she picked up her pen. "Then I'll be here." My apartment was a 20-minute subway ride from the office. We didn't share a cab, we didn't walk together. We left separately. She went first, without ceremony, just her coat and her bag and one look over her shoulder at me that I felt in my stomach, and I followed 15 minutes later. As though we were trying to preserve some fiction of coincidence. She was waiting outside my building when I arrived. She had her hands in her coat pockets, and she was looking up at the building with this expression I couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and resolve. Like she was making a decision she'd already made 100 times in her head, and was only now making with her body. "You found it," I said because I needed to say something. "You texted the address," she said. "Right. Are you going to open the door, Marcus?" The way she said my name, not Mr. Hale, not the careful professional distance she maintained in every meeting, just Marcus. Like she'd been saying it privately for a long time, I opened the door. My apartment was the kind of place that told you things about a person, bookshelves that had been organized and then abandoned halfway through, a kitchen that got used on weekends but not weekdays, a couch that faced the window because I preferred the city lights to the television. It wasn't messy, it wasn't pristine, it was honest. Simone walked through it slowly, taking her time in a way that felt intimate, trailing her fingers along the spine of a book, tilting her head at the photograph on the windowsill, pausing at the record player on the shelf like she'd found something unexpected. "You listen to records," she said. "My father's collection, I inherited it when he moved to Miami." I set my keys down. "I can put something on if you want." She pulled a record from the shelf without asking. Coltrane, A Love Supreme. She held it like she knew exactly what it was. "This was on the shelf at my parents' house when I was growing up," she said quietly. "My mother used to play it on Sunday mornings." She looked at me when she said it, and something shifted in the room, not the temperature, not the light. Something underneath those things, something structural, like the ground deciding to be slightly different than it was before. I poured us wine. She put the record on. We stood in my living room, with the city happening outside the window and Coltrane filling the space between us, and for a few minutes neither of us said anything. And that silence was the most honest conversation we'd had in 6 months. "Why did you really skip the dinner tonight?" I asked. She considered her wine glass. "Because you weren't going." I let that settle. "That's a complicated answer," I said. "It's a simple answer," she said. "The situation is complicated." She wasn't wrong about that. I was her client's account director. She was the external consultant. There were no explicit rules against what was happening in this room, but there were implied ones, professional ones, the kind that everyone understands without being told. The kind that exists specifically because situations like this one, a quiet apartment, a record playing. Two people who have been circling each other for half a year can detonate careers with almost no effort. We should probably talk about this, I said. We're talking, she said. I mean the part where this is a terrible idea. She finally looked up from her wine glass, and when her eyes met mine, I understood again. With the particular clarity that comes from being in the same room as someone who undoes you, why I had been lying to myself for 6 months. Because the truth was too much to carry and still function professionally. The truth was that I had wanted Simone Adler from the third day I'd known her, when she'd walked into a presentation I was giving and politely, thoroughly, quietly destroyed every assumption I'd built my pitch on and then said, "The core instinct is right, but the execution needs to be braver," and looked at me like she genuinely believed I could be. No one had ever told me to be braver in quite that way before, like it wasn't a criticism, like it was a door. It probably is a terrible idea, she agreed. That hasn't made it any less of an idea. Simone, don't, she said. It wasn't sharp, it was almost gentle. Don't do the responsible version of this conversation right now. We've been having the responsible version of every conversation for 6 months. I'm tired of responsible. I should tell you about the jealousy because it had been building for weeks before tonight and it deserves its own explanation. 3 weeks ago, a man named Daniel Reyes had joined the Halden account as a secondary consultant from Simone's firm. He was 34, good-looking in an uncomplicated way, and he had immediately positioned himself in Simone's orbit with the easy confidence of someone who knew her from before. They had worked together at a previous firm. They had history that I was not part of and had not been briefed on. He called her C. He leaned close when he showed her things on his laptop. He made her laugh in the break room with a private ease that made my jaw tighten every single time I witnessed it from the other side of the glass partition. I had told myself with great internal conviction that what I felt watching them was simply a concern about team dynamics, professional attentiveness, a manager's instinct. Then one afternoon Daniel had touched the back of Simone's chair, just rested his hand there. Just a moment, and I had excused myself from the room I was in and gone to the bathroom, and stood at the sink, and looked at my own reflection, and had a quiet, private reckoning with myself. I was jealous in the specific, consuming way that means you have already developed feelings you have been refusing to name. That same evening, I had stayed late finishing reports I didn't strictly need to finish that night, and Simone had also stayed late. And we'd ended up in the kitchenette at the same time reaching for coffee, and she had been 6 inches from me in that narrow space, and I had smelled her perfume, cedar, and something warm. Something that made you think of late evenings, and I had wanted to say 17 things, and instead I said, "Good reports this week," like a coward. She had looked at me with those dark, steady eyes of hers and said, "Thank you, Marcus," and gone back to her desk. And I had stood in the kitchenette alone, holding my coffee, understanding that I was in serious trouble. "Is there something going on with you and Daniel Reyes?" I asked. I hadn't planned to ask it. "It came out the way things come out when you've been holding them for too long." She looked surprised. Not offended, surprised, like she hadn't expected me to go there, or at least not yet. "Why are you asking me that?" she said. "Because I've been watching you two work together for 3 weeks and I stopped, reorganized. Because I think the answer matters to me and I'm trying to be honest about that." She set her wine glass down. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, not the professional composure, not the sharp precision she brought to arguments, but something more naked than those things. Something that looked like recognition. "Daniel and I dated for 4 months 2 years ago," she said. "It ended without drama. We're genuinely just colleagues. He doesn't act like that's all you are." "No," she said, "he doesn't, and I've noticed you noticing that." I put my own glass down. We were standing maybe 5 feet apart in my living room, Coltrane still moving through the air between us, the city making its slow noise outside the window. 5 feet is enough space to be reasonable in. 5 feet is not enough space when the person across from you has been occupying your thoughts every morning for 6 months. "I've been trying very hard," I said slowly, "to be the kind of person who handles this appropriately." "I know," she said. "I've watched you do it. You're very good at it. Very disciplined." A pause. "I find it absolutely maddening." Something in my chest cracked open a little. "You find my discipline maddening." "I find your discipline maddening because I know what's underneath it," she said. "I've seen the way you look at me when you think I won't notice. I've noticed every time, Marcus. For 6 months I have noticed every time." The 5 feet between us had begun to feel like a fiction. "And," I said, my voice was not as steady as I would have liked. "And I'm standing in your apartment," she said. "I think that's my answer." I crossed the distance first. I want to be honest about that. I moved first and it wasn't graceful or cinematic. It was just me closing the space between us, because I had run out of reasons not to. Because 6 months of careful professional distance had made me into a man who was extremely good at wanting something and extremely exhausted from not having it. I stopped with my hand against her jaw, her face tipped up toward mine, and I looked at her for a long moment because I needed her to be sure and I needed to see that she was. Her eyes didn't move. She didn't step back, she said very quietly, finally. I kissed her, not carefully, not tentatively, not the way you kiss someone when you're still negotiating terms. The way you kiss someone when you've been waiting for months and the waiting has made the wanting enormous, and you are done, finally, absolutely done, being reasonable about it. She kissed me back with her hands in my shirt collar and her body pressed against me, and a sound in her throat that I felt more than heard, and Coltrane kept playing. And the city kept moving outside the window, and the world contracted down to this room, this woman, this moment that had been building since the third day I'd known her. We didn't rush. That surprised me. I had expected urgency, given everything, given the months of pressure preceding this moment. But she pulled back after a while and looked at me with this expression that was half amusement and half something rower than that, and she touched my face with her hand. And we ended up on the couch with our wine reclaimed, talking. Actually talking. She told me about why she'd left her previous firm, a senior partner who had taken credit for her work on a major account and been promoted on the strength of it. While she'd been told she lacked the visibility for advancement, she'd left within 2 weeks. Built her own consulting practice, taken 3 years to get where she was. I told her about my father, who had managed a jazz club for 40 years and never once talked about money. And how I'd gone into corporate finance partly in direct rebellion, and partly because I'd needed to prove I could succeed in a world that didn't already know his name. How I sometimes put on his records at midnight, when I couldn't sleep and sat in the dark thinking about what success was actually supposed to feel like from the inside. She listened the way she did everything with complete attention, with that quality of stillness that made you feel like the most interesting object in a very focused room. Do you like what you do? She asked. I'm very good at it, I said. She tilted her head. That's not what I asked. No, I said, it isn't, she smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her smile without any professional context around it, without the meeting table or the conference call or the folder of reports giving her something to aim it at. Just the smile itself, private and a little crooked, aimed at me. I understood looking at that smile that I was in significantly more trouble than I'd thought. The second time she kissed me, she initiated it. We'd been sitting close on the couch, close enough that our knees were touching, and she'd turned to say something and stopped. And there was a moment, one of those moments with a very specific weight, where we were both aware simultaneously of exactly how close we were. I watched her look at my mouth. I watched the decision move through her eyes. She leaned in slowly. She kissed me with one hand on my chest and the other against my jaw, and it was different from the first kiss, less explosive, more deliberate. With a kind of thoroughness that made my brain go very quiet. When she pulled back, she was breathing differently. So was I. I want to tell you something, she said. Okay, I've turned down 2 accounts in the last month that would have taken me away from this project. She held my gaze. I told myself it was because the Halden work was prestigious. That's partly true, but it's not the whole reason. I looked at her. Simone, I know, she said. I know it's complicated. I know what it means professionally. I'm telling you anyway because I think you should know the full picture. What do you want the full picture to look like? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a siren moved through the city and faded. The record had ended at some point and the room was very quiet. I want it to look like something real, she said finally, not a mistake. Not something we file away under. It was one night. The circumstances were unusual. I'm 31 years old and I'm done with things that don't mean anything. This already means something, I said. It's meant something for 6 months. That's the problem I've been trying not to have. She looked at me for a long time. Something in her eyes softened in a way I hadn't seen before. Something that was neither the consultant nor the formidable professional, but just her, just Simone. In a living room in Manhattan at 10 o'clock on a Friday night with Coltrane on the record player, and her life rearranging itself slightly around a decision she'd made. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, I said. Okay, this is real, she said. We'll figure out the complicated parts. But this is real. I should tell you what happened next because this is the part that cost us something and I want to be honest about costs. The following Monday, Daniel Reyes noticed. Not because we were indiscreet. We were, in fact, extremely careful, careful not to arrive together, careful not to sit too close, careful to maintain the specific professional distance that we'd been maintaining for 6 months. But there's a kind of careful that reveals itself precisely because it's too deliberate. There's a visible effort in trying not to betray something that you don't make when there's nothing to betray. Daniel noticed because he knew Simone, and because people who have cared about someone in the past develop a particular sensitivity to the signals of that person's happiness. By mid-morning, he had gone quiet in a way that was different from his usual quietness. By the afternoon meeting, his eyes had moved between Simone and me twice in a way that told me he'd connected what he was seeing. He didn't say anything that day. He said something the next day. I was alone in my office when he knocked and asked if he could close the door. He was composed. I'll give him that. He was professionally composed in a way that told me he'd prepared himself before coming in. "I'm not here to cause a problem," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "All right," I said. "Simone is one of the most exceptional people I've ever worked with," he said. "I also know her well enough to know when something has shifted for her." He paused. "I just want to make sure you understand what you're dealing with." "I think I do," I said carefully. "She gives everything," he said. "That's the thing about her. When she decides something matters, she gives everything. And she's been hurt by people who weren't ready for that." He looked at me steadily. "I'm not threatening anything. I'm telling you something true about her." He left without another word. I sat in my office for 15 minutes processing that conversation, and then I called Simone. "I know," she said when I told her. She sounded tired, not surprised. "He texted me." "What did he say?" "He said he hoped I knew what I was doing." A pause. "He's not wrong to be cautious. He watched me go through something difficult after a situation where I trusted someone professionally who wasn't trustworthy in other ways." She was quiet for a moment. "He cares about me. I can't be angry at him for that." "Does it change anything for you?" I asked. She was quiet long enough that my chest got tight. "No," she said finally. "But I think you should know what you're walking into, Marcus. I'm not someone who does this halfway. If that's going to be a problem, it's not going to be a problem," I said. "You don't know that yet," she said. "I know it about myself," I said. "I've known it about myself for 6 months. I've just been too professional to act on it." A beat, two beats. "Your roommate's home tonight," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Then I'll see you Thursday," she said, and she hung up. Thursday, 4 days away. 4 days felt like an entirely unreasonable amount of time. Those 4 days were a particular kind of torture. We were in the same building for most of them. Same meetings, same floor, occasionally the same small kitchen where the coffee machine lived, and the space was narrower than was comfortable given the current circumstances. I would stand on one side of the room and she would stand on the other, and we would have professional conversations about project timelines and client deliverables, and I would watch her hands move. When she talked and think about her hands in my shirt collar. And she would meet my eyes at specific intervals that felt deliberate, calibrated, as though she was giving me just enough to keep me completely off balance. On Wednesday afternoon, she walked past my office and paused in the doorway and said without coming in, "Did you finish the Halden projections?" "I sent them an hour ago," I said. "I know," she said. "I already reviewed them." A small pause. "They were brave." She walked away. I sat at my desk for a solid 10 minutes doing absolutely nothing. Thursday arrived with the particular charged quality of a day you've been waiting for. My roommate Jard had returned Sunday and would be out Thursday evening for a birthday dinner that was expected to run late. I'd told Simone this in a text on Wednesday that I'd kept deliberately neutral. "Jard's out Thursday if you want to continue that conversation we started," and she'd replied with just a time. 8 o'clock, like we were scheduling a meeting. The specificity of it drove me halfway out of my mind. She knocked at 7:58, which told me she'd been close by waiting and had decided not to be early or late. She was wearing something different from her work clothes, dark jeans, a deep burgundy blouse, her hair down. I had never seen her with her hair down outside of that first evening. It changed the geometry of her face somehow, made her look both softer and more deliberate. "You look," I started. "Don't be strange about it," she said, but she was smiling when she said it, and she walked past me into the apartment with the ease of someone who'd been here before, which she had. But there was something different about the ease of it this time. Less negotiation, more arrival. The record player was already on. Different record this time, Bill Evans, something quieter, more intimate. She noticed it the moment she walked in. She turned to look at me with an expression that I'd come to understand meant she was filing something away. "Intentional," she said. "Everything tonight is intentional," I said. She held my gaze for a long moment and then she said, "Good, me too." We ate takeout on the kitchen counter because neither of us had thought to suggest a real dinner and it didn't seem to matter. We talked the way we'd talked the first night, freely, honestly, without the professional architecture that normally framed our conversations. She told me about her sister in Chicago who called every Sunday and who she'd told nothing about this situation. I told her about my best friend from college who had asked me 3 weeks ago with suspicious accuracy whether I'd met someone. What did you tell him? She asked. I said not exactly, I said. What does not exactly mean? It means I'd met someone a long time ago and I was still figuring out what to do about it. She looked at me across the kitchen counter with this expression that was three different things at once, pleased and cautious and something else. Something that looked like hope, which is perhaps the most dangerous thing to show someone you've only just become honest with. I'm going to tell you something, she said, and I want you to know that it doesn't require any particular response from you. It's just true and I'd rather you know it. All right, I said. The night of your first Monday morning meeting, she said, 6 months ago. When you were presenting that pitch and I came in and questioned your execution, I went home that evening and I thought about you for 2 hours. I was very still. Not professionally, she said, just you. 6 months ago, I said. 6 months ago, she confirmed. Simone, I know, she said. I said you didn't have to respond. I'm going to respond anyway, I said. I think you've earned a response. I set down my fork. The third day I knew you, I went home and rearranged every professional priority I had because I understood very clearly that being around you was going to make me want things I wasn't supposed to want. And I spent the next 6 months being very disciplined about it. I paused. I hated the discipline. She laughed, actually laughed, a real one, unguarded, and I felt it like something physical. You were so controlled, she said. Every meeting, every interaction, I kept waiting for a crack and you never gave me one. The kitchenette, I said, 3 weeks ago. You were 6 inches from me, her expression shifted. That one was close. That one was very close, I agreed. And Daniel's hand on my chair, she said. You left the room, I looked at her. You saw that? I saw that, she said. There was something warm in her voice, something that wasn't quite teasing and wasn't quite tender but lived right between those things. I'm not good at pretending things don't bother me, I said. No, she agreed. You're good at pretending they don't exist, that's different, she tilted her head. For the record, I noticed that you left. I noticed because I'd been hoping for a crack for 6 months, and a man removing himself from a room is a crack. If you know what you're looking at, the kitchen counter between us felt suddenly very much like something that could be walked around. I walked around it. She watched me come toward her with this expression that was entirely calm and entirely charged, like a storm that has decided it knows exactly where it's going to break. I stopped in front of her and put my hands on the counter on either side of her and looked at her. This woman who had been occupying 6 months of my thoughts with her precision and her composure, and the particular way she said my name. Simone, I said. Marcus, she said in exactly the same tone. Tell me what you want this to be. She reached up and took my face in her hands the way she'd done the first night, deliberate and unhurried, and she looked at me with those dark, steady eyes. I want it to be everything, she said. I know that's complicated. I know what it means for the project, for the account, for both of our reputations if anyone decides to make it difficult. I know all of that, she paused. I want it anyway. Then that's what it'll be, I said. She kissed me first this time. Slow and certain, her hands still on my face, nothing uncertain in it at all, and it tasted like everything we'd been not saying for 6 months finally being said at once. We dealt with the complications. I want to be honest about that too, because the complications were real and they had edges. 2 weeks later, I disclosed the relationship to my managing director. It was not a comfortable conversation. There were raised eyebrows and a quiet suggestion that it might be better for everyone if Simone's contract was concluded at the natural end of the project cycle rather than renewed. I pushed back on that, firmly, professionally, with a documented case for her value to the account. It was not the conversation I'd have chosen to have at that point in my career. Simone found out I'd done it, I told her, because it was her professional standing at stake and she deserved to know. She was furious for approximately 40 minutes. The kind of fury that comes from someone who has learned to fight every professional battle herself and doesn't easily accept someone else stepping into that space. Then she said, why didn't you tell me you were going to do that? Because you would have told me not to, I said. A pause. That's true. Another pause. I'm still angry. I know. I would have done the same thing, she said finally in a different voice. I know that too. The account cycle ended. Simone's contract was renewed through a separate channel on a different project with a different account director. The firewall was clean, documented, professional. It cost us some conversations and some awkward weeks and one dinner with my managing director that I would prefer never to repeat. It did not cost us each other. Daniel Reyes, for his part, behaved with more dignity than the situation required of him. He sent Simone a short text when the account concluded that she showed me, You look like you're choosing right. I hope I'm not wrong about that, she replied with a single sentence. You're not wrong. He'd sent back a thumbs up. He's a good person, she told me. He is, I agreed. I should have liked him better before I had a reason to, she laughed at that. She had a laugh by then that I heard in specific ways, the professional one brief and controlled, and the real one which started low and built. And which she used without performance when it was just us. I had become, in those months, a person who organized certain experiences around that sound. The night she finally met my best friend, 3 months after the kitchenette, 2 months after the disclosure, 6 weeks into whatever we'd agreed to call this. She shook his hand and he looked at me over her shoulder with an expression that said clearly, I understand now what you meant by not exactly. She fit in that evening the way she fit everywhere, with this contained, specific competence. This ability to be completely herself, without asking the room to adjust for her. She argued with my friend about a film I'd never seen. She asked his wife about her work and then actually listened to the answer. She drank the second glass of wine and laughed the real laugh at something he said. On the way home, I held her hand on the subway platform and she leaned against my shoulder. He likes you, I said. I know, she said without vanity. I liked him. You argued with him for 20 minutes about that film. It's a bad film, she said. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. I looked at her, this woman who had walked into a conference room 6 months ago and quietly rearranged my entire professional and personal gravity. Who said things like be braver and meant them. Who had made it clear from the beginning that she was not available to be a convenient choice or a careful mistake. Who had stood in my living room on a Friday night and said this is real and meant that too. I'm glad I told you my roommate wasn't going to be home, I said. She looked up at me. Something in her expression was very soft right then, in a way she allowed rarely and only when it was just the two of us. You were so nervous when you said it, she said. I was terrified, I said. I know, she said. That's how I knew you meant it. Here's what I've learned about this, about starting something real in a complicated place. About wanting someone in a context where you're supposed to be a professional and a rational person, and not someone with an irrational, consuming, 6-month-long desire that you're trying to manage with discipline. You can manage it. You can be professional and disciplined and appropriate right up until the moment you can't, and then the only thing that matters is whether what's underneath the discipline is true. With Simone it was true. It had been true from the third day, and I'd known it and spent 6 months pretending otherwise, and the pretending had cost us 6 months that we haven't gotten back and won't. I think about that sometimes. I think about the Monday mornings I could have been braver. I think about the kitchenette and the elevator, and all the moments where the distance between us was small enough that honesty was physically possible, and I chose discipline instead. I don't regret being careful, I regret not being brave sooner. Those are different things. She told me once early on that she found my discipline maddening because she could see what was underneath it. I think about that too. The things we discipline ourselves away from aren't always things we should protect ourselves from. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is want something real, and the most courageous thing is to want it anyway and go toward it anyway. Even when the context is complicated and the timing is imperfect, and there is absolutely no version of it that isn't going to require you to have some very uncomfortable professional conversations. She was worth the conversations, she was worth every single one, so I'll leave you with this. We talk a lot about timing and appropriateness and professional wisdom and doing things the right way at the right moment with the right amount of caution. And those things matter, they genuinely do. But here's the question I keep coming back to, the one I think about when I'm sitting in my living room with Coltrane on the record player and Simone reading across from me with her hair down. Living entirely in a moment I was almost too disciplined to arrive at, if you could see clearly that someone was worth disrupting your careful life for. Worth the complicated conversations and the professional rearrangements and the terrifying moment of saying the thing out loud instead of managing it into silence. What would it actually cost you to be brave sooner? Because waiting is its own kind of cost. And sometimes the bravest thing isn't the leap itself. It's admitting, finally, that you've already decided and you've just been standing at the edge. If this story landed with you, if you felt something in it that reminded you of a moment where you were almost too careful, leave it in the comments. Tell me about the edge. And if you want more stories about people who made the complicated, impulsive, emotionally risky choice and found out what was waiting on the other side of it, subscribe. We're here every week and we are never, ever choosing the safe version.